Cool. Thank you very much, Dr. Rob. Thank you all for coming. I too would like to pay my respects to the Aboriginal owners of this land that has never been ceded, and pay my respects to their elders past, emerging and present. I'd also like to thank the Latera Morena people whose lands I travelled through to be here today, coming down from the north. Thanks for coming along. I'd really like to thank my fellow Northern Tasmanian riders who have come along here too. It's great to see you. And just like with the Tasmanian cricketers who've represented our state, it's nice to know that all the talent still comes from the north. I mean, Tim Payne's okay, but count the others. After my first year of university, at this university, I went on a short holiday with some friends. On the plane, I read Will You Please Be Quite Please by Raymond Carver. Exactly the sort of thing an English studying, kind of pretentious, kind of annoying 18-year-old would read. My friend, sitting next to me, read From 1 to 100 Properties in 5 Years. I can't remember who wrote it. Halfway through the flight, he asked me what my book was about. I tried to describe the subjects of Carver's stories and how the dirty realism of their mundane lives was punctuated by moments of trauma, profundity, and love. I did a pretty poor job explaining. Afterwards, my friend asked, "So these stories aren't real?" When I said yes, he frowned and told me he couldn't imagine reading something that someone has just made up. In the years since, his comment has stayed with me. I still think about it all the time, and not in a way that puts him in a negative light. He remains a dear friend whose opinions I value. I remember it because I think he had a point. Why would someone bother reading something that another person has just made up? It's an extraordinary thing to ask of a stranger. Here, these people aren't real. None of this happened. It's set somewhere you know, maybe, but half of that is made up too, to allow for the fictional story to live there. You should read it. Give me $30. These days, I'm a novelist, and I rely on those $30 transactions. And thanks to this residency, for the first time, I'm a full-time novelist. I write books about landscapes and people, and the effects we have on the world, and the world has on us. I focus a lot on the environment. I often use myths, magical realism, different genres, unconventional formats, and a range of narrators and protagonists to tell my stories. Essentially, I make things up for a living. More often than not, I put these made-up things in a real place, or an imagined version of it. Here, Lutruwita, Tasmania, where I'm from. Although when I began writing, I never used to. When I left this university as a graduate, 8 or so years ago, I was convinced that there was nothing remarkable about this island. I didn't dislike it, I just thought it was ordinary. I grew up in the Tamar Valley and did a fair bit of bushwalking while at uni, so I knew it was beautiful. But I didn't think beauty was very important. And I was sick of hearing people talk about Tasmania like it had some kind of special ingredient that other places didn't. Everywhere was interesting, I believed, and therefore everywhere was ordinary. And everyone thinks that where they're from is more special than other places. I heard the words island literature a lot, and I rebelled against them. Every time I read a book review that said, the setting is just as much a character as the people, I wanted to throw up. If I was going to write fiction, which I knew I wanted to do, I thought I needed to tell compelling, emotional stories that could be set anywhere, with complex characters and cut-the-air tension that dealt with topics and issues vital to our inner lives. The people were what mattered. The place was just window dressing. At the time, I also believed that a fair meritocracy existed within our society, that we were definitely going to deal with climate change by 2020, if not earlier, and that Essendon hadn't really cheated when they injected their players with illegal supplements. Like most 23-year-olds, I was wrong about a lot of things. I moved to Melbourne, where I'd snagged a job in an advertising agency. In the evenings, I set about writing my emotional, complex stories. And I was really bad at it. I was already pretty bad at it at uni, but in Melbourne, I got worse. My stories were awful. The more I wrote, the less I knew what I was doing. Now I could recognise that I was doing poor impressions of the writers I looked up to at that time of my life. Writers like Carver, Richard Ford, and Tobias Wolff. White male American realists, mostly. But at the time, all I could see was how bad my fiction was. I didn't know much, but I knew enough to know the situation was dire. I could have stopped writing, but I didn't know what else to do with myself. I'm not good at anything else. I felt I had to succeed, but I didn't know how. Then I came back to Tasmania for a new job, but mostly for love. I'm painting a pretty ugly picture of myself in those years, but outside of all that literary arrogance, I promise I wasn't all that bad, and that a wonderful young woman really did love me. It worked out, by the way. I'm getting married in a couple of weeks. Anyway, I was invited to do a reading at a literary event by people who'd known me before my writing had deteriorated so much. I went through all my work and I realised I had nothing to read. Not only was every piece incredibly derivative, they were dull, unimaginative. So, stressed and anxious and worried about boring people to death, I stayed up all night and tried to write something that I'd like to read. Something without the sombre artifice of minimalism or realism. And before I knew it, I'd written a strange story set in Notley Fern Gorge in the West Homer Valley about a family of women who are temporarily reincarnated after being cremated. I was happy with how the piece came out, which was a strange feeling at the time. Afterwards, I followed the same instinct to write about things that intrigued me, that I wanted to read. I began to think hard about the places I love, the places I find myself dwelling on when my mind goes idle, the things that flash through my head after a couple of beers. Places like Fortescue Bay and the track that snakes out onto Cape Hoy. The Dolerite Cliffs, she-oak forests and black cockatoos of Narruntapu National Park. The curling ribbon of Kanamaluka, the Tamar River. The way my grandfather talked, his very Tasmanian rhythm of speech and the contours of his jokes. The lichen-patched boulders of Stack's Bluff, the swirling patterns of a snowgum's trunk near Bothwell, a quoll's face, frozen by torchlight. And yes, Notley Fern Gorge. As I wrote, I kept returning to these places in my mind. It was integral to how I created my first novel, Flames, which, perhaps unsurprisingly, is so thoroughly Tasmanian in every sense it's almost a cliche. And that first midnight piece I wrote ended up becoming the opening chapter. For my second novel, I thought, I can't do that again. I'm done writing about Tasmania. I created a nature myth about a bird made of water that has power over the weather, called the rain heron. I put this creature in an unnamed fictional country that had recently gone through a military coup. I unrolled a story of greed, of violence, of an environment ravaged by human ambition, of people struggling to find meaning in chaos, of hope. Initially, I based the landscape of this place on a northern hemisphere conifer forest, inspired by hikes I'd done on Hokkaido. But as the book went on, Tasmania began creeping in. Sparkling granite rock formations lined the country's coast. Squeaky, sugary sand covered the beaches. An arid area of midlands stretched through the interior, and cider gums sprouted on a high plateau. I've learned that these things will come out of you, one way or another. Since then, I've continued in a similar vein, putting stories in places that either are Tasmania or are recognisably similar. When describing the island, I often hold a line from the Tasmanian poet Pete Hay in my head. Here is evolution's flamboyance. Here, it is always showtime. In many ways, I now write island literature. And reviewers are often quick to note that in my work, landscapes are just as much characters as the people. Began with this story to show there's no one way to find your voice as a novelist. I didn't write about Tasmania straight away or come to it in a straightforward manner. And partly to explain why I write Tasmanian fiction. It's not just because I grew up here or that I live here. It's because the island is twirled into my mind, and my best work comes out when I let Tasmania assert itself into my stories. I know the imaginative elements of my books can be confusing for some people. After reading Flames, a friend's father instructed his son to tell Robbie that there are no wombat farms in Melaleuca. Apparently, the divine water rat and cloud god were a bit more believable. I know that people feel very strongly about their home and can feel confronted when someone comes along and writes a book that shows an altered version of something they know to be true. I understand. I feel passionately about Tasmania as well. But I make stuff up anyway, and I'm going to keep doing it. And I do it for a couple of reasons. One is that it's fun. I'm not going to lie to you, it's a lot of fun. Two, the books are in the fiction aisle. You can make up what you like over there. If you're writing historical fiction, for example, even if you do painstaking research and get all the details of the era right, you're still inventing people who never lived there or then. I've never seen much difference in inserting a fictional blacksmith into a perfectly realised medieval village and putting a wombat farm in Melaleuca. Neither of them are real. What matters isn't the veracity of the details, it's how the invention feels. And that's what I check. When twisting made-up things into a real place, I ask myself, how does it feel? Does it feel like a natural extension of that world, or does it jar with reality? Is it self-indulgent, or is it inviting? If it's unbelievable, isn't something I'm tempted to believe anyway? That's how I came to write about an imaginary tradition on Tasmania's north coast, where fishermen form bonds with seals and hunt tuna in partnership, in a similar way to a farmer herds sheep with a kelpie. It felt both impossible and real. I didn't know if others would agree, but that's how it felt to me. You only have your own instincts to go on. Something strange happens when we create the impossibly real. By inventing alternate versions of our world that manage to chime with reality, that match the rhythm of our imaginations, we start to think a bit differently. Not necessarily better or kinder, but broader. To see our world with eyes wider than the ones in our heads. That's why I think it's important to write and read imaginatively, so that in our increasingly STEM-oriented society, we can live imaginatively. This might sound a bit starry-eyed, but living imaginatively means that we can imagine better ways of existing. So when numbers and charts point to economic benefits associated with stapling a cable car over Canunni's organ pipes, we can imagine the harm it would do to our souls. When our kelp forests die, detach and wash up on the east coast, we can imagine ways and reasons to protect and preserve them. When a politician is duplicitous and authoritarian, we can imagine what the consequences of their lies will be. When fires lick towards ancient pencil pines, we can imagine the cost of losing them and do something about it before they're gone. Yes, science and technology will help us do these things, but technology is imaginative too. Science gives us the what, and imagination helps us find the why. That's what guides my thinking when I'm reinventing Tasmania. But of course, I'm far from the first person to write about Tasmania, and I'm surely not the first writer to benefit from the Tasmania fiction that's gone before me. Obviously, there was over 65,000 years of known heritage in Tasmania where storytelling existed very importantly throughout the landscape through the culture of the people here. Before I started taking myself incredibly seriously and became a disciple of minimalism at 18 or 19, I grew up reading Tasmanian novels by Tasmanian novelists. I think the first was For the Term of His Natural Life. I still think about the cannibal Gabbett whenever I see red flesh in the deli. Then there was the work of Christopher Koch, Amanda Lowry, Richard Flanagan, Heather Rose, Catherine Scholes, Jeff Dean, Danielle Wood, and more. A varied array of writers with varied styles of writing of topics they pursued through their fiction. Almost always, Tasmania and Tasmanianness was present. As a teenager, I was able to see the world around me depicted in the books I read, not something some of those writers were able to do when they were my age. And these books allowed me to understand Tasmania in ways history and reportage never could. I wonder if I'd have the capacity for imagination and curiosity I seem to have developed if my grandmother hadn't given me a copy of They Found a Cave by Nan Chauncey when I was young. If it hadn't been for The Roving Party by Rowan Wilson, I wouldn't have learned of Manalagenna and his incredible importance to our history and culture, nor would I have a thorough understanding of the atrocities committed by the colonial settlers from whom I believe I descend. I would have a fundamentally different understanding of Tasmanian society if I hadn't read Blue Skies by Helen Hodgman. And there's simply no way I would have been able to conceive of the version of Tasmania I wrote about in Flames if I hadn't read the version presented in Gould's Book of Fish. My water rat would never have dreamed of marrying a cloud if Billy Gould hadn't dreamed of Matthew Brady's Army of Light. And there are lots of other books, of course, Out of Ireland, The Alphabet of Light and Dark. Through them, I was able to understand my world in a new way, to see it with eyes wider than the ones in my head. It was and is a profound gift to see one's culture and home as worthy of literature, and to be shown that this is possible, it can be done. Thanks to these works and many others, writing fiction about Tasmania isn't blinked at anymore the way it was before the turn of the millennium. Ask any writer who was producing work down here in the 70s, 80s, or even 90s, what mainland publishing presses and papers thought of them and their work. That barrier has largely been removed. Publishers are open to Tasmanian books. Some are hungry for them. It's become known that Tasmanian readers will support a local book, perhaps more than readers in any part of the country. But challenges remain. In 2017, the Ranelagh writer Ben Walter published an essay in Overland magazine called "You Can Be a Successful Writer, but Only If You Live in Melbourne or Sydney." It's not an ambiguous title. I won't repeat all of Ben's argument, but essentially he highlighted the difficulties associated with making a living as a writer outside of Australia's two largest cities. For a start, the overwhelming majority of Australia's publishing houses are based in Melbourne and Sydney. So are the literary agents, the critics, and the chatterati influencers of culture. The same goes for our most powerful cultural institutions. If you're a young writer looking to meet an editor, gain experience in the publishing industry, or network with people who can help further your career, and let's face it, networking remains key to a lot of careers in literature, you'd have a lot more chance in those bigger cities. Pathways for emerging writers in Tasmania are slim. Quite understandably, a lot of writers move to those bigger cities to gain access to those opportunities, which contributes to another problem. More writers living in the same place, surrounded by the same stimuli. It's been nearly 4 years since that essay was published, and little has changed. In many ways, it's gotten more difficult. I don't want to take up too much time talking about the slash and burn approach the federal government seems to have taken with arts funding, but suffice to say that things aren't good. The Australia Council lost $105 million in funding in 2014. Since then, the cuts have only continued. Grants are more competitive than ever. It's bad for writers everywhere, but for writers in Tasmania, there aren't those cultural institutions or publishing relationships to fall back on. True, we have Island Magazine, the Tasmanian Writers' Centre, University of Tasmania, and the illustrious Thomas Dewhurst Jennings Institute. But if a young writer were to go to a launch of Island's latest issue, it's unlikely they'll run into an ambitious editor from Penguin looking to build a list of authors. They won't be pulled into conversation with one of the head honchos from the Wheeler Centre. And it's doubtful they'll bump into the programming manager of the Sydney Writers' Festival on the hunt for bright young voices. They might see a punch-up between poets, but you can see that anywhere. To compensate, writers who stay in Tasmania and write about Tasmania need to stand out. And it can be done. We have many talented, wonderful writers, many of whom are actually in this room today. Some of the barriers are down. Agents and publishers might read their emails, where in decades past, they wouldn't bother opening their letters. But it's still a challenge. There's also the same hurdle that exists for all writers, to be original. And perhaps it is even greater for Tasmanian writers now than it was before, because as Tasmania has become ever popular and well known outside of its own borders, the temptation rises for writers to play into the comfortable tropes that non-Tasmanians associate with it and with us. I'm not big on telling other writers what to write. A writer can only write the story that thrums through their veins. But I am big on pushing language into new shapes, on reimagining ways of doing things, and finding fresh ways to convey emotion and narrative. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that maybe, perhaps, just for the moment, there's enough Tasmanian Gothic fiction floating about, both as books and as TV shows and movies. There's nothing wrong with it. I like a lot of it. But Tasmania is so much more than a dark setting with a tragic past. Go outside. Dark isn't the right word to describe this place anyway. Not many Tasmanian writers write like this these days anyway. It's mostly mainland or international writers who set their stories here, lured by romantic cliches and tired readings of place. I can remember a creative writing class I took at UTAS as an undergraduate, where my lecturer showed us a passage of writing from a novel set in Tasmania, written by a well-known mainland writer, who I won't say on camera who it is, but I'll tell you later if you come ask me. In it, the Tasmanian narrator, is utterly horrified at the sight of some roadkill, as if a dead wallaby is a rare, startling sight on Tasmanian roads. It was a good lesson in authenticity, and the perils of letting an authorial presence get in the way of a reader's immersion. There are all sorts of Tasmanian stories that are still yet to be told in so many styles. I've spoken about why I believe in the power of using myths, magical realism, and imagination. But that's just my way of doing things, and perhaps it's only just my way of doing things at the moment. There's nothing preventing someone writing sharply insightful Tasmanian stories about relationships, class, and sex in a hyper-digital age. Why shouldn't there be a Sally Rooney of Tasmania? The Dublin of her novels is a distinct, vibrant place that could be nowhere else but Dublin, and the people could be nobody else but the Irish. And yet her novels transcend their Dublinness. Elena Ferrante's novels, particularly her Neapolitan quartet, capture the intensity of juvenile friendship in a way that has rarely been done before with extraordinary skill. The city of Naples hums through the pages, sun-soaked and violent, and yet these books transcend their Neapolitan nature. And as a reader, that's what I'm most looking forward to Tasmanian books that capture Tasmania while also transcending it as a setting. Books that reinvigorate how we see the world, that alter how we behave. I don't play into the idea that reading fiction automatically makes us better, more empathetic people. That seems to be a thing some writers and arts organisers have been saying lately in order to convince the government that our nation's literature is worth supporting. Kind of a please increase our funding, our books make the populace better. It's nice, but I don't think it's true. As the essayist Maria Tamarkin recently said, reading doesn't make us any more empathetic than gardening. Reading might make you more empathetic, but reading fiction can also radicalise you. It can empower you. It can make you excellently, importantly, uncomfortable. That's why I await books that, as a young Kafka would say, wake us up with a blow to the head. Books that are the axe for the frozen sea within us. And only afterwards would we remember that was a Tasmanian book. The most exciting thing is this is already happening. Many of the writers I mentioned earlier are still writing and releasing books. Richard Flanagan's most recent one, The Living Sea of Waking Dreams, is, in my view, one of his most astonishing. So too with The Labyrinth by Amanda Lowry, who is perhaps underappreciated for her mastery of characterisation. Over Christmas, I read the Vogel-winning A Treacherous Country by Catherine Krumink, and afterwards found myself hurling it at everyone in my family like a whaler's harpoon. It's a historical, colonial, feminist farce, and it's so slippery and evocative, and it's really funny. I was also one of many who loved The Octopus and I by Erin Hortle, a book that captures Tasmanian coastal culture while ruminating far beyond it. It's not just novels, either. Young writers like Vivian Cutbush and Zoe Douglas-Kinghorn are producing some of the finest, most interesting work I can think of. One of the books I'm most looking forward to this year is a short story collection. It's called What Fear Was by Ben Walter, that reclusive Ranelagh author whinging in Overland I mentioned earlier. Ben's been writing wondrous, lyrical stories for a long time. He's the most widely published short story writer in the country. He's been shortlisted in 4 consecutive Tasmanian Premier's Literary Awards. His collection is a cause for celebration for Tasmanian fiction. And when I first delivered this talk a few weeks ago in Hobart, there was another upcoming Tasmanian short story collection I was excited about to tell people about. It's now out. It's called Born Into This by Adam Thompson. He's remarkably talented and a wonderful storyteller and writer. And he's from northern Tasmania, and I challenge readers, particularly Tasmanian readers, but every reader around Australia and the world, to walk away from his stories unmoved. He's also an Aboriginal Tasmanian writer, and the publication of his work adds an important, necessary, and wonderful voice to the Tasmanian canon. It's tempting to say that we need more Aboriginal Tasmanian voices, but the truth is that we don't. They're already here, and they've always been here. They're already speaking, and they always have been. We need them to be heard. Most importantly, we need them to be published. I suggest you all go buy Adam's book if you haven't. During this residency, I'm working on my 3rd novel. It features no myths, no magical realism, no inversions of reality, at least not yet. It's set on an orchard on the banks of Kanamaluka during the final year of World War II. A 16-year-old boy is trapping and shooting rabbits, selling their skins to the army to be turned into slouch hats. He's hoping to make enough money to buy his own boat. His older brothers are away at war, and his father, who was a survivor of both Gallipoli and the Somme, is struggling to hold himself and the orchard together. This protagonist dreams of open water and waits and prays to hear from his brothers, while the future rushes toward him in a flurry of blood and fur and sunshine. It's inspired by stories my grandfather told me about his own childhood. Maybe it'll turn out that I'm nothing without the pyrotechnics of magic and myth. Perhaps this book will end up being an unoriginal, run-of-the-mill piece of historical fiction that doesn't add all that much to Tasmanian libraries. And I hope not, but who knows? Richard Flanagan recently said that the best books are the ones that escape their author's intentions. I think he's right. I hope this new book flies away from me on wings I don't see growing. I was telling my friend about it the other day, the same friend I went on holiday with as an 18-year-old. He's done quite well. He owns quite a few houses now. He's also started reading fiction. He bought my first 2 novels, but says he's particularly looking forward to this one, given it's a bit more straightforward, a bit less made up. I thought I'd conclude this talk by reading the opening section of it. It was believed a whale had gone mad at the mouth of the river. Several fishing boats had been destroyed in acts of violence so extraordinary they were deemed inhuman. Each attack had come at dusk, while the boats were passing the heads on their way back to port. the same area where plumes of spray were allegedly erupting from the water. Large transport ships reported powerful, mournful vibrations ringing through their hulls. Gulls flew strangely, cormorants seemed skittish. Ocean swimmers' strokes were thrown out of rhythm by a high ancient melody that rose through the salt. A fluked tail had been seen, troubling the waves. Ned was 5 years old when all this happened. In later years, he struggled to remember the incidents with much clarity, but at the time, it was all anyone was talking about. The animal had been harpooned far down south, someone's uncle said, and after fleeing north was now visiting vengeance on any ship it encountered. Another version of that story claimed the harpoon had lodged in the whale's brain, turning it feral and vicious. Another was that the whalers had missed the beast, but not its pod, and the creature had been driven insane after witnessing the slaughter of its family. There were other theories too, ones that didn't include whaling, ideas of chemical runoff and irradiated krill, although they weren't paid much attention. Most held the southern whalers responsible for fouling the animal's mind. There was talk of writing letters, demanding reparations, getting the council involved. "It's nonsense," Ned's father told his children. He'd caught them whispering about the boat wrecks at the dinner table, unaware he'd returned from the orchard. "There is no whale," he said. "No monster. Fishermen do 3 things. They drink too much and they make stuff up." He took off his coat and hung it on a hook by the door. "What's the 3rd thing?" asked Ned's brother, Bill. Their father levered himself into his chair. Occasionally, they catch fish. But their father's words did not convince them. The story of the mad whale had sunk too deep into their minds. Ned's sister, Maggie, was old enough to restrain herself from contributing to the gossip and hearsay, but Bill and Paddy talked about it constantly. Ned heard everything, and their conversations filled him with obsessive dread. All day he thought of the smashed ketches and skiffs, of an unseen giant with a blade snagged in its brain. At night his dreams were flooded with blood-foamed water. For a week he woke sweating and screaming until, when his exhausted father demanded to know the cause of his turmoil, he revealed that his nightmares were of the murderous, hell-sent whale. "Right," his father said the next morning, toast cooling on his plate. "We're going to the river mouth tonight. I'll show you the truth of this so-called man-killer." Late that afternoon, he took his sons to a nearby jetty, where they piled into a small boat their father had borrowed from a neighbour. For an hour, they motored along the river until the course of the water straightened and the sea beyond it widened to fill the dusk. When they reached the mouth, all that remained of the sun was a half disc of orange light over the western hills. Their father killed the motor. "Forgot to bring rods. Sorry, boys." They stayed there, bobbing on the light swell. The last sliver of sun vanished and the sky darkened into a clear night. The father leaned back in the boat, appearing to contemplate the thick pattern of starlight above them. The wind was cold. Ned and his brothers shivered into their collars as they waited for the whale to explode out of the river and paste them into the waves. Thank you very much for coming, guys. Thank you. And I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has, or comments, or abuse, or anything you guys have got. While you're thinking, I'll tell you a funny story about one of the last questions I got, which was at a writers' festival where a man who identified as a men's rights activist stood up and, abused me, and it was really, really cool. Because he said I only write about female characters in my fiction in order to, how did he put it, appeal to the market, and that I was a self-hating man. I just thought I'd share that one. It was really, really funny. Yeah, I think if you're pissing off men's rights activists, you're doing the right thing.
Thanks, Robbie. That was wonderful. I've been to the Glover exhibition today, which is about Tasmanian landscape, and in some ways it's fictionalising Tasmanian landscape, some of it more than others. And you made the comment about the Gothic, so much of Tasmania is Gothic and dark, and one of my takeaways from the Glover was there were an awful lot of Gothic, dark images of Tasmania. And they were trying to tell a story, really, often about rape and pillage of the landscape and environmental. And I'm thinking, I must confess, I've only read Flames. I haven't read your other novel. But I was thinking, as you write, are you like an artist, and are you also trying to provide a message about Tasmania and about what's happening, or could or shouldn't, or are you trying to tell a story for enjoyment? And does that affect whether or not you need to be dark in the way you approach it?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. don't know if I am like an artist, but it's something that is common to a lot of literature and a lot of art about whether or not it has a message at its core. I mean, I try and see myself as a storyteller first and try myself to try and entertain, and then my fiction will be filled with things that I am preoccupied with. What I would not want to do is set out with a core moral message and then write a book that is a lesson. I'm not that sort of writer. I couldn't do that well. It wouldn't suit my style at all. I'd rather let the things I'm preoccupied with come through in the work, so it is more of a discussion with anyone who reads it and they can bring their own experience to the book and interpret it their way, rather than me as an author saying, this is what I think, this is my opinion, delivering it from a mount on high. So that's how I approach it. I don't know if I always get it right, but it's how I think about it, because the last thing the world needs is strong opinion from someone like me. And just to touch on this idea of Gothic stuff in Tasmanian pigs, the reason I kind of have a problem with, not only because I think it's a bit done, it's an intensely European lens to apply to Tasmania. This idea of tradition of Gothic storytelling comes from old European romantic traditions, and I just think we don't need any more of Tasmania to be viewed through a European lens. It's not particularly helpful or original, and there's enough of it. It's really reductive to use that kind of dark, spooky storytelling, haunted woman in the attic sort of storytelling. I just don't think it applies very strongly to Tasmania as it ever was or as it is now. So that's why I'm not really into it. I bloody hate the Kettering incident, but that's just me.
In recent times, particularly since COVID, we've become very aware of Tasmania being an island and circulated by sea. And I think that informs, in my opinion, a lot of creative talent within Tasmania. And I'm wondering how often that comes into your consciousness about the fact that Tasmania is an island surrounded by sea.
Yeah, I don't know, probably subconsciously quite a lot. But it's not something I actively think about a lot. I don't know. It's great that people from Sydney can't drive here. That's fantastic. Or at least they have to come on a boat to do it. But apart from that, no. I think about Tasmanian culture in a sense of it being somewhat isolated and different. I think that's one of the best things about Tasmania is we have a distinct culture from much of mainland Australia. But I guess that's more of a subconscious element of it being an island. I don't generally sit around thinking about I'm in a castle surrounded by a moat or anything. It probably comes through.
Robbie, I just wanted to ask, obviously the residency is a really big opportunity, but also from my own perspective, it kind of feels intimidating in that you're spending a really long time with a particular project, which is probably quite a change for you as someone who's always worked and written at the same time. And I just wonder, now that you're progressing through it, how it has been to have this opportunity and what have been the positives and also some of the challenges that have come with it.
Yeah, it's been really cool. I know it's more traditional to be very humble and say, I'm just working hard, everything's really good, but honestly, it's awesome. I have all this time to write, and before this I've been working full-time hours and beyond full-time hours forever. So it's amazing to have this time to write. I'm really grateful and I'm really happy for it. I'm getting heaps done. But also, I am still somewhat busy. If you want to be busy, plan a wedding. And another way to do it is plan a wedding that's going to go ahead during the year a global pandemic occurs, so then you replan the wedding. So I've got plenty on my plate, so I still feel like I'm quite busy. But no, it's going really well. I just feel really lucky, yeah.
I'm wondering about the, and I don't want to say ethics because I don't think it's the right word, but the how you feel about adding mythology to a country and a place that has a mythology and that has an Indigenous mythology that is so deeply compromised in terms of our ability to access that, those of us who are non-Indigenous, but also because of the history of this island, Indigenous people's own ability to access that Indigenous mythology.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. It's something really, really worth talking about endlessly, really. My approach of doing this was when I was writing Flames quite a few years ago now, was to try and come up with my own mythologies that were not based in any existing ones, particularly not Tasmanian Aboriginal mythologies or stories. I'm not Aboriginal, and it's not in any place my story to tell or to have anything to do with that. But what I want to do, I was always interested in myths and origin myths in particular, and these ways that we can try and understand the world through things that aren't purely rational, in ways we can try and evoke how the world feels, not so much how it actually is. Because I think when you go out into the Tasmanian wilderness, it feels a lot different than perhaps you can actually describe it accurately with the English language. So I was really interested in doing that. And at the time I had no publishing contract, so I thought I would try and make up my own myths, and with the best possible intentions, without appropriating or using any form of Aboriginal storytelling, because there's no reason why I would do that. There's no ethical reason why anyone would. And it's entirely possible I really messed up a few times and made missteps. I haven't had any conversation with anyone who's felt that way so far, but I'd be really interested in hearing if I had, because that's how you learn and that's how we as a culture do things better. But the short answer to how you approach, I guess, the ethics, if that's what we mean by this, my view would be to only tell stories that you feel belong to you. It is a complex thing to do when it's so rooted in landscape, but at the end of the day, you have to, as a storyteller, take risks. And sometimes those risks are going to not pay off and you're going to do the wrong thing. Hopefully you can avoid doing that by having the best intentions and by listening to people. And that's just probably the best answer I can give you. Because this is honestly not something I'm actually personally totally okay with. Like, I feel a bit weird about it now once I did it. So yeah, it's a complex thing.
Just picking up on Sarah's question, does that relate in any way then to how, say, in Flames and also in The Rain Heron, it's obvious to see that you've played with place. There are places that are named, but they're not those places that come through in your book. And there's this sort of subtle shift in the way that particular places are described, and sometimes not so subtle. I'm pretty sure Tunbridge isn't the way you describe it in Flames.
No, Tunbridge isn't at all.
Yeah, but
it isn't in Flames.
Could you talk a little bit about that representation of place and playing with real places but reimagining them?
Yeah, I mean, in Flames there's lots of Tasmanian places named. Well, the word Tasmania is not in the book at all, but it's obviously very real Tasmanian places are named in it. And I tried to make it so clear that everything was imaginative in the first chapter with these women coming back to life after they've been cremated, that I just trusted readers would go along with me in order to know that I'd made things up about these places as well. And part of the reason to do that and part of to make things up about these places is, one, is a boring answer to suit the story and to suit the narrative I was creating. And the other one is to allow yourself to imagine how things might be and allow things to be a little bit different, because like I was saying earlier, I think imaginative thinking and imaginative reading and writing is really important to how we view the world and how we possibly come up with how we're going to continue living in the world. So playing around with these sense of place and changing real things, I did in a sense to serve the story and to be imaginative in something that feels real, feels impossible, but you kind of want it to be true in some sense. And I tried to avoid setting anything too specifically in some of those places, because once you name a place, it comes with all the baggage that any reader will have associated with that place. So people have a feeling attached or their knowledge attached to a certain place. It was why you read so many books about young, listless men wandering around New York, hoping that like a beautiful young woman is going to come teach them how to be a man. So I was trying to avoid things like that, but it's inevitable when you're writing about real places.
Thank you. Robbie, I just wanted to ask, have you had any feedback of how the book's received, like internationally or interstate? Because I think us all as Tasmanians really resonated with the understanding of Tasmania, but I don't know, I can't relate to how that would be interpreted from someone who wasn't from Tassie, basically.
Yeah, well, I still haven't got my cheque from Tourism Tasmania, so I'm pretty pissed off about that. I mean, I don't know. I think it did pretty well in the mainland. I think I've never asked about sales or anything like that. But in England, it came out in England, and people were just thought that's what Tasmania is. And then for a while I thought I've really misrepresented my homeland here. I've really messed up. But yeah, I think a lot of people leant into the kind of savagery and wildness of it, which was good because that's what I was hoping for, people not to think of Tasmania as just Bay of Fires or just Cradle Mountain, which is what comes across to a lot of people from Sydney who can't drive here. The one thing that's my favourite reaction I ever got from someone from the mainland was I was in a Melbourne bookstore doing a signing and the lady came up to me and said, now I'm going to Tasmania soon, I booked tickets. Where on the north coast do you go see the hunting of the tuna with the seals? I said, oh, you know, I made that up, that's not real. She goes, no, I know you made up the stuff about the water rat and the fireman and the wombat farm, but this one's real. My friend told me it was real and I've got tickets for my daughter and I. And I looked up at Hawley, it says not there, is it perhaps at Devonport or something? I had to say to it, no, it's really not real, I can totally made it up. Why do you think it's real? And she got mad at me, like actually angry. Wanted to know, you know, what else she can do. I was like, well, there's a chocolate factory there, but yeah. Yeah, so she was annoyed, but it was pretty funny.
I can relate to that because as I was reading those descriptions in Flames, for a moment, you know, you're asking your reader to suspend disbelief. And I think the verisimilitude that you get in that description, it really sucks you in as a reader. I kind of was starting to question myself, you know, could this actually be real? And you had actually managed, I think, to capture a sense of something that wasn't real, but felt like it should be or could be.
Yeah, I was hoping to create things that people knew wouldn't be true, but wanted them to be. Not necessarily didn't want people to think that wombats were being skinned alive and devoured by demon cormorants, but that this idea of the seal could be real. And I had this kind of approach when I'm making things up that I think is, for me, a good way to go about writing imaginatively is to just assume the reader will go with you once you make it clear what's happening. As soon as you start explaining impossible things over and over again in a story or in a novel, then it just gets boring. You're showing all your tricks. That's not why people aren't reading books to have things explained to them. They're reading books to be entertained. So I just make this stuff up and hope that people go with me because they can always take the book back. Nothing's easier than throwing a book across a room. But I think it's more inviting to ask people to come along with you rather than to explain to them exactly why they should as you set up the guide ropes.
I have a lot of questions I could ask, but I'll go with this one because hopefully it's the most useful, particularly for those of us in the room who are writers. You're well into your third novel now and you've written a fabulous lecture and you've written some short stories and other bits and pieces. What have all those things taught you about writing? So what do you know now that you didn't know when you started the first page of Flames, for example?
Yeah, I think I'm a pretty bad short story writer. I wish I'd known that a few years ago. And I don't say that to be self-deprecating, like I genuinely don't think I'm very good at it. So I'm not going to be trying to do that much unless I have to. I was saying in a masterclass this afternoon, I don't necessarily think I've learnt lots more about writing or gotten better at writing or uncovered all these amazing truths. I just feel I've gotten better at recognising bad writing. That's the only way it feels. I don't think I'm getting better at writing great things. I'm getting better at recognising what doesn't work and what doesn't click and what doesn't flow. And that's essentially how it feels. I'm not a writer who writes something that I think is good and then pat myself on the back and go over Bogue's Red. I'm much more inclined to just work at it till I feel like it's acceptable. And that is now happening quicker because I'm recognising what doesn't work quicker. Probably a really disappointing answer because it'd be better to say, oh, I've figured out this trick and put a semicolon on the fifth word and then you're away. But no, yeah, it's just, yeah. Don't use semicolons. My editor gets so mad at it. He thinks I use too many. Yeah, I probably do.
Robbie, can I take you back to the seals and the tuna?
Sure.
I'm reading again Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu, 2nd edition. And knowing I was coming to this talk, I was suddenly struck by the killer whales herding the other whales to the Aboriginal people on the beach in southern New South Wales and being rewarded with the offcuts. And I thought, that's where Robbie got the idea.
It's part of it. Yeah, I did go to, it's in Eden. And I've been to the museum there where they still have the skeleton of Old Tom, the killer whale who was about 80 years old, and at the time was hunting with European whalers. But we know that these killer whales were hunting with the local inhabitants of the area for thousands of years, not quite sure how long. It was something that the European whalers copied off them. So that was part of it, but actually the relation between the seal and the fisherman actually came from a friend of mine who's a farmer, and he's got a farm out at Carrick. And I was out at his farm watching him herd sheep with his dog. And he doesn't even whistle or talk to the dog, he just moves his head in different ways. And the dog will do one of 30 things, and I just couldn't figure it out. And that was actually where the inspiration for the seal, because the seal is basically just a dog mermaid. So I kind of figured it out that way, and then this idea of the killer whales clicked in too. So it was a bit of a combination of both, actually. I hope that's helpful.